You need to have the proper space so that when everything gets processed, there's still enough separation in the levels that when the elastic comes back, none of the dots are touching still.
Yeah, so I'm going to go to this Gills question next. Shout out to Gills. Gills asks, what are the biggest things that have taken your songs from amateur to pro level? I know that it's not just one thing, but what are the biggest things to help make that transition?
Oh, man. You guys want to lead this one off? My answer is very simple but passionate.
Yeah, so a few things pop into my head that I wish someone would have told me when I was in those intermediate stages. And we actually kind of touched on it already. And one of those is like taking and building a lot of the auxiliary parts for your song out of the main genesis of what you already made, right? So like when you're starting to make a song, say you're writing a dubstep tune, you got your kick snare in there, and then you've got your main bass line, and like that's all you have so far. Like, use your main bass line to resample out some sort of version of it and then make that the B section. Or when you're working backwards into your buildup and you have like a section of this mud pie that you didn't use for your drop, like make a manual volume fade and make a riser out of one of the bass noises that you didn't use that is also similar to what's going to come in the drop, you know? So you're like kind of previewing the palette. Or, you know,
RL Grime does that really well.
Yeah, totally. And then like, you know, another easy one is like taking an element that you're bringing in and like reverbing the shit out of it, sampling that reverb tail, flipping that bitch around and putting it in front of the sound so that it swoops into the sound to preview. I mean, that's a super basic one, but for anyone out there who isn't doing that, vocals, that's like almost like do that shit, because there's no better way to make a vocal feel like it belongs than to have one of those sweeps before it.
Yeah, that's a good ass trick.
Especially like a big bright lead that just comes out of nowhere. It's like, oh, it's a little weird. Hit it with that reverse sweep. But so that's number one. Use what you already have to create what you don't. That's a big one. Number two is if you feel like something is not good enough, instead of add, delete. Like you have a good bass line and you're like, oh, this is good, but I want this to be more captivating. I'm going to add another layer and throw more shit at it. Don't do that. If your bass line is just good and the patch that you have is not working, turn it off, make a new one, try something else. Trying to shoehorn a good thing into your great song is never going to work. To make a great song, you have to delete good parts. Mm-hmm. That is
major key.
So hard to learn because you have the sunk cost fallacy of what you've spent time on that you will never be able to get back. And you assume that because you spent time on it, it has to be in the song, or it's worth being in there. Maybe you'll just turn it down to like -20. No one will notice. Don't do that shit. Delete it or turn it off, but don't let those good parts ruin your great song.
Kill those puppies.
Yeah, kill those puppies. Shoot them in the face.
Yeah.
Right.
And then
gotta.
And then the third thing would really just be like, don't make the full song until you have a good spark, a great spark, an amazing spark, something that gives you that like really excites you to make that song. Because there's no better way to get to the end of a song that you've made and go, it's good, shelf it. Is never coming out. It's because you started with a good idea and then you built a song on a good idea and then it's just a good, okay song. You know, if you start with a chord progression that gives you chills, everything else that you build out from there, an arpeggio from those chords, a bass line that you take from those chords and resample, everything that you build out from those chords is going to be incredible because it started with an incredible seed, right? if you start working forwards before you have that thing that really captivates you, you're not going to create the best thing you've ever had, probably, at least for me. Like, I have to start with something that's like really good. So those are my top 3.
I kind of agree with that last point at a point.
Same.
Because if you are where Rip Kenny is and able to take any idea he makes across the finish line of mixed and mastered processed quality that is able to be released, then yeah, why are you wasting your time on a mediocre chord progression? But if you're in the stage as an amateur producer who does not yet know how to consistently take ideas across the finish line, if you spend all your time worrying about whether or not the chord progression's too good without ever attempting to arrange and mix and master, you're never going to build those 3 absolutely key skills that you completely need to make a song that's worth listening to, that's professional. So when you're starting out, I would say err on the side of getting to quality through quantity. Another thing we learned from Ill Gates. Shouts out to the man himself, Dylan. This is one of those things you have to get over the fear of, like worried about whether this one song is going to be the one that makes or breaks your career or whatever. It doesn't, none of them will if you don't know how to finish tracks. So if you have an idea and it's the one you got today and it's the best one in the pile, arrange it, mix it, and master it, and then do the same tomorrow, because that process of actually knowing how to mix and master an arranged track that you made is completely key to you being able to make any kind of song that sounds professional.
Yeah, I was assuming that the question was like, I know how to make a song. I know how to
take songs from amateur to pro.
How do I get my songs from being okay or intermediate to being like really like pro level? I can grab people, you know?
Amen. So yeah, good call, good distinction. I'm glad we got both ideas out there because they're both completely correct.
Yeah,
first,
man.
Focus on the process, then really focus on what you're putting into that process.
I agree with both of you guys. I think there's, making sure that source is right is just invaluable. Like, if your chord progression doesn't loop properly, you're not going to fix that by EQing it right. So like certain shit, just needs to be right at the source for it to sound good in the final product. Now, one thing, if I had to say one main thing, leveling. If you've taken a session with me, I fucking harp on leveling all the time. And what I want you guys to think of is like as if I had an elastic band and I cut it and I stretched it out. And in most people's sessions, I find generally between the loudest sound and the quietest sound, everything is sort of squished into this 15 dB range. Now, if we mapped it out with dots on this elastic and stretched the elastic, that's what I want people to be thinking like when they're mixing. So everybody thinks like, oh, I pulled this in. It's equally as important. Let me make this riser just as loud as my kick. Honestly, usually louder. But people will be like, let me make this thing that's less important just as loud as the important thing. And I really want people to overemphasize those core elements, which are super important to your song, versus the secondary elements and the more background ambiance sort of stuff, and push that stuff more back, push the stuff that's important more front. Because if you're comparing just your mixed song in your genre, whether that's pop or EDM especially or whatever, these finished songs have a master on them and they're compressed, and the elements sound like they have this relationship of compression that's gluing everything together. So if your song doesn't have that, it's not going to sound like your reference. It's not ever going to sound pro level. If you're trying to write dubstep, for example, and it doesn't sound smashed, everything together like that, it's not ever going to sound right. So you have to keep that in mind and then know, okay, my master is going to get compression, maybe some limiting, all these things that's going to close in that dynamic gap. So let me, like the elastic, stretch everything out a bit more in anticipation of the inevitable squashing. And then you can start to see how you can fit so many more things in your mix. And now suddenly everything is clean and accurate. And you realize that shit you had at -2 dB actually needed to be at -35 dB because it's a very screechy siren. And turns out our ears can pick up on that kind of shit, even when it's super quiet. So take advantage of that. I want to close it off by saying, when you're mixing, you don't mix in one element. You're mixing in an element relative to another, or relative to a group of other elements, right? So if I'm tweaking my hi-hat, let's say, I'm not really listening how loud the hi-hat is. I'm listening to its position relative to the other elements. So as it gets further away from the kick and snare, how do my kick and snare sound? That's what I'm listening to when I tweak my hi-hat, for example. So you're listening for those relationships. So, you know, just be aware you need to have the proper space so that when everything gets processed, there's still enough separation in the levels that when the elastic comes back, none of the dots are touching still. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Having more dynamic range in your mix level than you thought you needed to compensate for the fact that everything's getting squashed together by your mastering limiter. That's
have a rough master
key.
too.
Yeah, that is a pro tip for sure.
Yeah,
and that's why I if you have the ability to with your processing power on your computer, I recommend that people put a mastering chain on their mix session. I used to, with my old computer, have to bounce out a 2-track to be able to run all of my mastering chain at once, but that I would always find these imbalances and then have to switch back to the other session, make the changes I thought I was making, bounce it back out, bring it back into the mastering session, make a new set of notes because I hadn't nailed it. Now I'll go through my entire mixing process, turn on the mastering chain element by element, get it loud, and then be like, oh yeah, that snare's too loud. Oh, you know what? The hi-hats are actually too quiet. Oh, you know, that vocal, I did not EQ enough of that pain zone out. It's still harsh. And I'll just do that after I master it. I will go back and tweak the mix because I am currently able to. Also, there's a lot to be said for, you know, for Ableton users, freezing and flattening, but committing to audio, no matter what DAW you're in. If you've got a Serum instance with a whole bunch of extra VSTs on top of it, that's taking up a lot of your computing power to do all that math. If you pretty much nailed how you want that thing to sound, make it audio, and then you got whatever 20-30% of your processor back, and now that can go towards your mastering plugins. And if you do that across the board at some point, just, you know, save the session as a new session, commit everything to audio. You can still go back to the other session and get back to that MIDI if you really need it, but get that processing power back so you can have your mix and your master in the same session if at all possible.
I like it.
What's up, humans? It's Luke, your friendly neighborhood trap Jesus. Thanks so much for watching the podcast, checking out our videos. We truly appreciate you. So, Rip Kenny, Tesco, and myself got you a gift. We made you a free sample pack. It's got basses, it's got FX, it's got crazy percussion and Foley sounds, and it's free. It's all yours. Just click the link in the description below. Also, make sure to hit that subscribe, hit that like button, and share this with your friends. We appreciate you. Peace out and peace among worlds.